Mother Nature was the star of Lecture 3. You discovered how she can affect a wine's flavor, body, aromas, structure, and quality. Now it's time to see how people affect what you taste in your glass. This will help you to predict which wines you will like and to choose wines made with specific elements or in a certain style. You'll need the following wines for this lecture: the Saint-Exupéry Sauvignon Blanc, the Robert Mondavi Fumé Blanc, a Rioja Crianza, or in this case we have a Reserva, and then a Rioja Gran Reserva. Today, you are the winemaker. If you pick too early, the fruit flavors in your wine will taste underripe, too green, sour, and astringent. Way too long, and your wine can taste unbalanced, too alcoholic, not fresh enough, or the fruit can taste too ripe, like dried fruit. So what do? How do you make that call? Once again, I've asked Geneviève Janssens, Director of Winemaking at Robert Mondavi Winery, to help us figure this out. One of the things I'd like to ask you is, right before harvest, and when you're walking through the vineyards looking at the ripeness, what kind of decisions do you have to make in order to determine ripeness and they're ready to be picked?
In the morning when I get up, I always turn on the weather station at home and I see what is the weather for the day and for the week. So we all have to do that because our decision will be based on if the weather is very nice for us or can be very brutal for the grapes. So that's the first step I'm starting to do. I always do that. Then I walk the vineyard and then I test the grapes and the berries and look at the condition of the canopy and the leaves and the clusters too, because we are in a very nice area, but the sun can be difficult. So dehydration is very important to observe. So condition of the grapes, dehydration or stress, water stress for the leaves. And then after I have done the assessment of the vineyard and the condition of the vineyard, I look at numbers from the lab. So the pH, the acidity, the Brix are very important, but not a major factor for my decision making for harvest. So that will be all the elements, and I am putting together to understand the date of harvest. And of course, my memories is very important because very close to harvest, I walk the vineyards every day, every morning. And then I just remember what I saw a day before and 2 days before. And if I see a dramatic change in the condition of the vineyard, it means that it's time to pick. And if the vineyard is still happy, and the vineyard talks to you very nicely, happy, not happy, and that's when I have to decide.
So there's a great deal to think about and do before you're ready to harvest. I mentioned that winemakers also must make sure that the berries are just the right degree of ripeness. What do you suppose they're looking for? We'll ask Geneviève. Is there anything that you look at with the grapes that can tell you that it's ripe?
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of criteria. If it is very soft or hard. If it is hard, it means that it is not ready to be picked. And usually I go back in 4 days and I let the sun doing the work and the vines. But if it is getting soft and liquid, so I always squeeze the berry and I see the liquid going down. And if the liquid is going down and I have a lot of liquid, it means the fruit is extremely close to be harvested. When the color goes out on my finger, it means then the color is ripe and ready to get out. And that's another indicator of date of harvest is very close. So then I test it. And then I chew a lot on the skin. And if the skin is, let's take Cabernet Sauvignon as an example. If the tannin of the skin are very soft, gentle, very harmonious, it's time to pick. If the skin is a little bit harsh, still harsh, and the tannin are still a little bit green, I have to let it sit on the vines. So that's why it's very important to have the weather always in mind, because if the weather is going to be too hot, the skin is a little bit green, I have to take a risk. All the time it's an evaluation of risk. Winemakers take all the time risk. So I have to decide, should I leave the fruit on the vines? Should I pick the fruit tomorrow, depending on the weather? So it's a balance between all of those elements which will make my decision making for harvest.
Geneviève mentioned to me that she might taste 50 berries in a day. If you're ever on a vineyard tour and they allow you to taste some of the grapes, here's how you do it. What you do is you take it in your mouth and you chew on it to get the pulp out of its skin and also the pips, which are the seeds. And what you're going to do is you're going to spit the seeds into your hand and take a look at the color of the pips, because that can actually give you an indication of their ripeness. Geneviève also briefly mentioned the term Brix. Brix refers to the level of sugar in the grapes, which is measured with a refractometer. Measuring the grapes for their level of sugar can help determine when the grapes are ready to be picked. Grapes are picked quickly, and as Geneviève mentioned, not all grape varieties are picked at the same time. But another decision you make as a winemaker, who do you choose to pick the grapes? A man or a machine? You may see the term hand-picked on the back label of a wine bottle or on a winery's materials. It takes a lot of labor, energy, and effort to individually pick those grapes. If you've ever gone to a winery's harvest party where they let you pick the grapes, it's fun for all of about 5 minutes. After that, you realize it's back-breaking work and want to go back to sipping your wine at the party. But why do we care? Why do we care as a consumer if it's hand-picked? We care because it can mean a higher cost per bottle, as it can be an expensive process. But it can also mean better fruit, higher quality, as the individual picker decides which clusters and in some cases which berries to pick. Mechanical harvesting is harder on the grapes, as the harvester is shaking the vines so that the ripe ones fall. You, the winemaker, however, can see this as an enormous benefit, as it's cheaper and much, much faster. To harvest a vineyard by hand requires between 1 and 10 days per hectare, or almost 2.5 acres. But machine harvesting cuts the time to 5 hours. Have you ever been to a winery? They come in all shapes and sizes. Haras de Perque in Chile looks like a horseshoe, literally a horseshoe. Marqués de Riscal in Spain looks like a modern art museum. Frog's Leap looks like a barn. And Pichon-Baron-Longueville in Bordeaux looks like a castle. However, they all share the same types of elements. The grapes usually arrive at the winery here. Many times they are placed on a sorting table, where a team sorts through the grapes to pick out not only the bad bunches of rotted grapes, but also leaves, bugs, and other kind of nasties that can make the wine taste off. They might sort it once or twice, but in some cases they do it 3 times. This is a lot of work and labor, so generally wines that have this are in the ultra-premium and luxury price category. After sorting the grapes can be placed in a crusher destemmer machine, which separates the grapes from the stems for white wines and for most red wines. Some red wines in Burgundy, for example, leave the stems in to kind of bulk up the tannins. However, most of the time they're left out because they add astringency to the wines. The grapes are then carried in whole bunches or crushed and brought to the pressing room. This is where the grapes are pressed. For white wines, the skins are separated, but for red wines, the skins and seeds are kept. The juice is then referred to as must. Now that you have the must in the tank, you have another decision to make. How are you going to start fermentation? Yeast is present in the air and on the skins of the grapes, and fermentation can spontaneously happen. Are you going to allow this to happen, or are you going to inoculate with your own cultured yeast? Sometimes on bottles you will see a reference to indigenous or wild yeast. This can either mean you left the must to ferment on its own, or you used a lab to separate out unique yeast strains that is really special to you, or special to the area. Or you can buy yeast, just like if you're baking bread, you can go up to the supermarket. But for here, you create a culture and add it to the must to start fermentation. Each type of yeast will change the nature of the wine. Yeast are just like people. We look different, we smell different, we have different energy levels, and we work at different speeds. And each one of us has a unique set of skills. When you use only one yeast strain, the fermentation is predictable, which as a winemaker you like, and gives the flavors that you are looking for. When you allow indigenous or wild yeast to ferment, you're in a sense allowing the entire crowd of people to work simultaneously. The fermentation can be a bit more unpredictable, however, and this can result in wine having many layers of flavors, which we call complexity in wine, and can create a rounded, more textural round mouthfeel. Now, where does the must go after that? Let's go back to Robert Mondavi Winery to find out. They say that wine is a living, breathing thing. And when you have it in your glass, it's one way. And then as it ages, it turns into something entirely different. But where does it all begin? It begins right here in the fermentation tanks. This is the birthplace of wine. Now, after the grapes are harvested and pressed, what happens is the juice is brought here to the fermentation tanks. And for white wine, it's just the white juice. But for red wine, it's the white juice plus the skins from the red grapes. And what happens is you have the color leaching into the wine to make it red. They have the juice plus the skins, but you gotta keep those skins, which actually float up to the top of this tank. You've got to keep it moist. Why? Because there's all kinds of microbes that can cause all kind of faulty things in the wine, and you don't want to taste that in your wine. So what they do is they pump some of the juice from the bottom and put it over the top. And what that does, it has the juice come through the skin cap, and then it will leach the color more and more color, more flavor. However, for certain grape varieties, such as Pinot Noir, or even sometimes Merlot, what they'll do is instead of pumping the juice over, they'll actually have someone standing up at the top of the tank, and they will punch down the cap. Stainless steel is an inert metal that doesn't impart any flavor to the wine. So let's taste the Saint-Supéry Sauvignon Blanc, which is fermented in stainless steel. Now we'll do our swirl as we learned. The chest, the chin. Stick your nose in the glass. Wow. There's a lot of pure Sauvignon Blanc flavors in there. There's some grassy tones, there's some citrusy flavors, and that all comes from the Sauvignon Blanc. And you get some lemons, some fresh figs in there, not the fig Newton kind, but some fresh figs in there. But remember that aroma that you get in there. However, stainless steel is not the only type of vessel that wine can be fermented in. Here we are in the oak fermenter room at Robert Mondavi Winery. You see here, unlike in the stainless steel tank room, we have large wooden oak fermenters. So in here, they ferment their red wine. These are the fermentation vessels that the grape juice is going to be coming into. Now, these are for red wine, and they're going to include some of the skins so that you can have the color leach out. But the reason why they would use these fermentation vessels as opposed to the stainless steel tanks is because the oak has some oxygen coming through the oak staves. So that actually adds more of a mouth feel during fermentation and kind of helps it along in the process. As you can see, it is oak, but it's not new oak. The reason is they don't want to add any new oak character, that spicy vanilla character that you get into wine. We're going to talk about that in barrel maturation. This oak is old oak. It's about 10 years old. But these barrels will last about 50 years, as opposed to what you see in barrel maturation that will last maybe up to 4 or 5 years. But you see a lot of this in Europe, and we're going to be talking about when we see oak fermentation vessels in later lectures. Now we'll test the impact of oak barrels. It can be like the ones we just saw, but even more so when it's matured in oak. First, remember that flavor or aroma you got with the Saint-Supéry Sauvignon Blanc? Now what I want you to do is pick up the Robert Mondavi Winery Fumé Blanc. First of all, can you tell a color difference between these two wines? You probably can see a bit of a difference because those that are fermented in oak and barrel mature, like the Robert Mondavi Fumé Blanc, there's a little bit more color. Now let's smell the Fumé Blanc. You get some of those Sauvignon Blanc aromas, the fresh fruit and the grassy tones. But what else are you getting? Because it's fermented and matured in oak, you're also getting some vanilla and creamy-like aromas. Now let's taste it. What that oak does as well is provide a little bit more weight, but it adds more richness in the flavor as well. This is the difference that oak makes. Once all of the grape's sugar has been turned into alcohol, remember the old formula, sugar plus yeast equals alcohol and carbon dioxide, you have the wine right where you want it. Or do you? Will you mature the wine further before you bottle it and release it? Some wineries fine, or filter. That's a process to clear sediment. And bottle right after fermentation to retain the youthful fruitiness. However, another option is to mature your wines, whether they're red or white, in barrels to add additional flavors and complexity. Barrels are most often made from wood from oak trees. But why oak? Why not pine or maple or chestnut? Oak is easier to shape into the barrels, and once in contact with liquid, it seals better than other types of wood. This is one of the major reasons why oak was used for shipbuilding. Oak adds the most complementary flavors to wine, such as vanillin, and just as it sounds, it adds a vanilla-like character, and lactones, which in higher concentrations can give a coconut-like flavor. Pine, maple, chestnut wood can add too much of a resin flavor, and you don't your wine smelling like pine sol. Just like the different grape varieties have different flavors, different types of oak add different types of flavors. French oak is known for a tighter grain within its wood, with higher tannins and lower aromatics than, let's say, American oak, which is known for more intense aromas of coconut and dill. However, on the palate, American oak is a bit more coarse, meaning it's larger in its tactile sensation of the tannins, and it's a bit less finesse than a French oak. Many wines in the US, Spain, and Australia use American oak, particularly for the hardier reds that can stand up to the intensity of American oak. Even oak from specific forests within one country can add different flavor characteristics to wine. Within France, oak from the forests of Allier adds beautiful vanillin character and is much more elegant in its tannins, meaning they don't feel rough on your palate, versus, say, oak from Limousin, which is pretty much too intense for wine, is reserved for maturation of cognac. Once the origin of the oak is chosen for the barrels, the wood is then sent to a barrel cooper to be formed into a barrel. The wood can be seasoned for a few years, which softens the aromas and tannins imparted into the wine. The seasoned wood is then made into staves that will fit into the rungs to form a barrel. The barrels are then placed over a fire. The heat allows the wood to bend so that the cooper can place it in the rungs on the opposite end of the barrel. However, the amount of time the half-formed barrel stays on the fire imparts new flavors and dimensions to the wine. As the barrel toasts, the wood sugars on the top layer of the wood become caramelized, which can add a sweet vanilla flavor, but can also add toasted aromas to the wine. The longer that you leave it on, the more toasty that it gets. Heavy toasting, however, can reduce some of the strong coconut flavors of lactones, even in American oak barrels. It's all up to you as the winemaker to determine what kind of flavor you want to come through and complement the wines. Let's go to the barrel room to take a closer look. These are oak barrels that the wine is matured in, and this is red wine that's inside of here. We have Taransaud. This is a cooper from France, so this is French oak. And what that adds to the wine is a vanilla and a spice character, but there's also a code on here. You see HT. That means it's got a high level of toast. So when this barrel was being made, there's an enormous amount of toasting that was done. So this is the highest level and adds the most amount of toastiness to the wine. And you'll also notice here it says 225 liters, which means that there are about 300 bottles inside this barrel. Now, I want to take you over to right across the way to this barrel right over here. And it was also made by Terre Sud. However, you'll see the code for MT, or medium toast. In this, it's going to be a little bit less in its toastiness, but it's a little bit softer. And we see a little code right over here, and it says CF. That probably means this is Cabernet Franc from the 2009 vintage. The size of the barrel can make difference in flavor too. The smaller the barrel, the more wood surface area to wine ratio. This means that more of the wine is touching the surface of the wood, which provides much more flavor. The barrels we saw at Robert Mondavi are called barriques. They hold about 225 liters. They're generally the smallest size barrels used in winemaking, and they impart the most amount of flavor. In Bordeaux, they go from a 225-liter barriques to tonneaux, or 900-liter barrels, which is the equivalent of 100 cases of wine, just in one barrel. Now, barrels impart the most flavor. However, when winemakers often reuse barrels for the next year, there are fewer flavors added. But the oxygen can still come through the oak and harmonize the wines. There are also some wines that use 200% New French oak, like the Garagiste wines from Bordeaux, which we'll discuss in Lecture 10. The wine is placed in 100% new barrels for 9 months to get all of the richest flavor. And then the wine gets transferred to a new set of 100% new oak barrels. This is how they come to the calculation of 200% New French oak. Now let's go speak with Geneviève again and go through a barrel tasting of wines that were recently placed into barrels. We're going to taste from one of those barrels, as I was talking about with High Toast. We are here in the barrel room of Robert Mondavi Winery, and we're going to conduct something for you, a barrel tasting.
So here is the wine, and we are going to taste it together. So give me your glass. Perfect. So we are sharing.
Why don't you take us through a barrel tasting, and what are you looking for when you taste each of these barrels?
Every barrel will have an individual temperament and taste and flavor. So we have different coopers, and it's very important to taste them all, and we do that. And we just talk about what the component of the barrels will bring to the wine, to the vintage. We are using 100% new French oak. And this is always to follow Mr. Mondavi's vision. He wanted to be extremely elegant, finesse, and we like that sweetness of the oak in the French oak.
Geneviève will taste the wine in every barrel in that room until it has matured into harmony. Not too much oxidation. The oak flavor is perfectly integrated into the wine. As wine ages, because of oxidation, the color of white wine increases towards a golden hue, and red wines go from a purple to a ruby red to a tawny brown. Take, for example, these two wines from Spain. Here we have a Reserva, or you may have a Crianza, and the Crianza is, by law, required to be aged in oak for about 6 months, whereas the Reserva that we have here is a year. Then we have a Gran Reserva, which is minimum of 2 years, but sees much long bottle aging as well. And as you'll notice on this bottle, this is 1999 as opposed to the Reserva, which is 2005 that we have here. Now let's go to our white napkin and see if there's any color differences here. And you're probably going to see a huge amount of color difference. The one that's from the older wine and the one that's been aged in oak longer is going to have a much more brown or tawny hue to it. Whereas the one that's aged less is going to have more of a purple ruby tone. Now what I want you to do is smell both of them. In the Reserva, I definitely get some fruit character in there with just a hint of spice. Now let's look at the Gran Reserva. Wow, there's a much bigger difference in terms of the aromas. With the Gran Reserva, there is a much bigger leather tone and spice tone. when I say leather, I don't mean it actually smells like a shoe. I mean it actually has hints of leather that add to its complexity. And why this happens is because of oxidation. Oak itself is a porous material, so it has oxygen going through it. This shows you the impact of barrel maturation. Once the wine has matured, as much as you desire as the winemaker, you can employ clarification techniques to make sure that there are no floating bits in the wine. Fining is done first, and it involves adding negatively charged particles to attract the positively charged particles called colloids that are suspended in the wine that can make a wine cloudy later on. But how do they do this? How do they add this? In Bordeaux, egg whites were traditionally used. The egg whites were dropped through the barrel, and all of the colloids would actually stick to it. They'd be attracted to the egg whites and drop to the bottom of the barrel. Filtration is done after this, not before. But I should warn you that this is a hotly debated issue among winemakers. To filter or not to filter, that is the question. Some winemakers feel that if you filter, you strip the wines of its true character. Because most people like a bright, clean, pure-looking white, the debate mostly rages around the filtering of red wines. Those in the pro-filtering camp deny that it strips any flavor and prefer that to the risk of having little microscopic organisms that can produce off flavors in the wine. However, some wines absolutely need filtering, particularly unfortified wines with any residual sugar left over after the fermentation process. In other words, if the wine doesn't go through sterile filtration, yeast can start eating the sugar and cause a re-fermentation inside the bottle. I mean, who wants a glass of effervescent German Riesling or effervescent California Cab? Now that your wine has been clarified, you can bottle it, label it, and cork it. Or perhaps screw cap it. My husband and I have debated screw caps for years, as he's still under the impression that screw cap wines are inferior. However, for some wines, particularly white wines, screw caps can prevent oxidation and allow the wines to retain their youthful fruitiness for longer. Cork, like oak, is a porous material. So it allows little micro-oxidation to happen. And that's the reason why people age higher quality wines for longer periods of time, for that harmony, elegance, and changing of the flavors. But we'll talk more about knowing how long to age your wine and how to properly open a corked wine in Lecture 23. We have journeyed through both Mother Nature's and man's impact on wine, and how that's affected the wine in your glass. Up next, we dive into the nature and characteristics of specific varieties, the noble grape varieties. You're going to need a dry Riesling, preferably from Australia. You're going to need a sweet Riesling, preferably from Germany. It could be a Kabinett or Spätlese. And then you're going to need a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, as well as a Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire Valley. Here we have a Sancerre, but you may find a Puy-Fumé. Also, again, we're going to come back to Chablis from France, as well as an oaked Chardonnay. These are the grape varieties that you see the most often, but more importantly, they are the noble grape varieties because they are grown all over the globe while retaining their character and produce some of the highest quality, longest lived wines in the world. Until then, cheers.